Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time often romanticized, a world of knights and castles, but beneath the surface of chivalry and courtly love, there was a simmering cauldron of discontent.
We're going to explore something you might think.
You know, but trust me, you won't believe medieval protests were this violent.
Forget your modern-day picket lines.
This was a world where grievances were often met with pitchforks, torches, and a very real chance of losing your head. You're about to step into the muddy boots of a medieval peasant, or perhaps the grimy hands of an urban artisan, navigating a world where injustice was rampant, and the only way to be heard was often through the roar of a mob. And let's be
honest, you probably won't survive this journey without at least one moment of genuine shock.
So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know
in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now.
Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, daughter, as you close your eyes, and let the soft hum of the fan transport you. You find yourself standing on the edge of a medieval
village. The air thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and a pervasive sense of unease.
The sun dips below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the thatched roofs and muddy lanes.
You hear whispers, hushed conversations behind closed doors, and the occasional clatter of a tool being sharpened, not for farming, but for something far more ominous. This isn't the idyllic medieval life you've seen in storybooks.
This is a
world on the brink, where the common folk, pushed to their limits, are starting to dream of defiance.
You sense the simmering anger, the quiet desperation that precedes a storm, leading to the first sparks of rebellion. Mainstream historical fact, medieval society, particularly in the late Middle Ages, was frequently punctuated by popular revolts, driven by a complex interplay of economic hardship, social inequality, and political grievances.
These were not isolated incidents, but widespread phenomena across Europe, reflecting deep-seated tensions between the ruling elites and the common populace. The causes were often multifaceted, ranging from oppressive taxation and feudal obligations
to famine and disease, all contributing to a volatile social environment.
It was a pressure cooker, and sometimes it just had to blow. One quirky tidbit about these early whispers of discontent is how information, or rather misinformation, traveled. In a world without mass media, rumors and grievances spread like wildfire through informal networks at the village well, in the local tavern, during market days, or even through traveling preachers and minstrels. A distorted tale of a lord's
cruelty or a king's unfair tax could ignite a spark hundreds of miles away, often amplified and embellished with each retelling.
It's like the medieval version of a viral tweet, but instead of likes and retweets, it led to pitchforks and burning barns.
And probably a lot less fact-checking, which, let's be honest, is still a problem today. Historians still argue whether
these early, localized acts of defiance were spontaneous outbursts of desperation, or if they were the result of more organized, albeit clandestine, planning among the common people.
Some scholars suggest that the sheer brutality of medieval life and the sudden onset of famine or plague could trigger immediate, uncoordinated reactions. Others contend that even seemingly spontaneous revolts often had underlying networks of communication and leadership, however informal, that allowed for a degree of coordination. It's a bit like debating whether a flash mob is truly spontaneous, or if someone just sent out a really good group text. The truth is likely a blend, with desperation often providing the fuel, and nascent organization providing the spark. You walk through the village square, noticing the subtle signs of simmering anger.
A group of peasants huddles, their faces grim, discussing the latest decree from the Lord's manor, perhaps a new tax on their meager harvest, or an increased demand for labor on the Lord's lands. You see the worn tools in their hands, now
gripped with a different kind of resolve.
The air is thick with unspoken resentment, a palpable tension that hangs heavy like the evening mist.
The usual sounds of village life, the distant bleating of sheep, the gentle murmur of conversation are replaced by a brooding silence, punctuated only by the occasional cough or the rustle of straw. It's the calm before the storm, a quiet defiance that speaks louder than any shout. Another light joke. You know, I bet medieval lords had a very specific kind of headache, not from too much wine, but from trying to figure out why their peasants kept looking at them with that particular run of the light joke. You know, I bet medieval lords had a very specific kind of headache, not from too much wine, but from trying
to figure out why their peasants kept looking at them with that particular, "I am going to burn your manor down" look.
and then they'd probably just dismiss it as indigestion.
Because who would ever think a peasant could organize anything, right?
Oh, how wrong they were. The causes of this simmering discontent were manifold. The feudal system, while providing a semblance of order, often placed immense burdens on the peasantry.
They were tied to the land, obligated to work for their lords, and subject to arbitrary taxes and levies.
Famine was a constant threat, and the slightest crop failure could push entire communities to the brink of starvation. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, further exacerbated these tensions. While it devastated the population, it also created a labor shortage, giving the surviving peasants a newfound, albeit fragile, bargaining power.
They began to question the established order, the divine right of kings and lords, and the very foundations of their society.
It was a time of immense suffering, but also a time of awakening, where the old certainties began to crumble. This period
also saw the rise of itinerant preachers and radical thinkers, who challenged the established religious and social hierarchies.
Figures like John Ball in England, with his famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" articulated the grievances of the common people and provided a theological justification for rebellion. These were not just economic protests, they were often imbued with a powerful moral and spiritual dimension, viewing the existing order as unjust and contrary to God's will.
It's like a medieval TED Talk, but instead of inspiring innovation, it inspired
revolution, and probably a lot more shouting. As the night deepens, you hear the distant baying of a hound, and the wind carries the faint scent of fear.
The whispers grow louder, no longer confined to hushed tones. You see figures moving in the shadows, gathering, their faces grim but resolute.
The first spark is about to ignite, and you realize that the medieval world, far from being static and unchanging, was a dynamic crucible of conflict, where the oppressed, when pushed too far, would rise with a terrifying, violent force. The stage is set for a confrontation, a clash between the powerful and the powerless that will shake the very foundations of society. And you, my friend, are right there, on the cusp of it all.
Last time, you felt the simmering anger, the quiet desperation that brewed in medieval villages.
Now that anger is about to boil over, you're about to witness the raw, desperate power of peasant uprisings, driven by hunger, injustice, and
a deep-seated frustration with a system that seemed designed to keep them perpetually down to end.
This isn't a theoretical exercise.
This is the brutal reality of a people pushed too far, rising up against their oppressors with a ferocity born of desperation. Imagine a scene, a small village, perhaps like the one you just left, suddenly erupts.
The whispers have turned into shouts, the sharpened tools into weapons.
You see men and women, their faces grim and determined, armed with whatever they could find: pitchforks, scythes, axes, even simple clubs.
They are not trained soldiers. They are farmers, laborers, and their families. But their numbers are growing, and their collective rage is a palpable force. The local lord's manor, once a symbol of impregnable authority, now looks like a target. This is the peasants' revolt, or the jacquerie, or any one of countless uprisings that scarred the medieval landscape.
It's a terrifying spectacle, a visceral demonstration of what happens when the lowest rung of society decides it has nothing left to lose.
It's like watching a pressure cooker explode, but instead of steam, it's human fury, mainstream historical.
Fact, the late Middle Ages, particularly the 14th and 15th centuries, witnessed a significant increase in large-scale peasant revolts across Europe, such as the jacquerie in France 1358 and the Peasants' Revolt in England 1381.
These uprisings were often triggered by a combination of factors, including oppressive taxation, feudal burdens, famine, and the social and economic dislocations caused by the Black Death, which ironically, by reducing the labor force, sometimes
gave peasants a temporary advantage. One quirky tidbit about these peasant armies is their surprising, albeit often short-lived, ability to organize. Despite lacking formal military training or established leadership, they often managed to form rudimentary command structures, elect leaders like Wat Tyler in England, and even coordinate movements across regions.
They might use church bells
to signal gatherings, or send messengers on horseback to spread the word of rebellion. It's like a medieval flash mob, But instead of dancing, they're planning to burn down the local tax collector's house.
And probably a lot less synchronized. But equally effective in causing chaos, historians still argue whether these peasant revolts, despite their often brutal suppression, ultimately contributed to long-term social and economic changes that benefited the peasantry, or if they were largely futile acts of desperation that only reinforced the power of the ruling class. Some scholars suggest that the fear of future uprisings compelled lords to ease feudal burdens and offer better conditions, leading to the eventual decline of serfdom in many areas. Others contend that the immediate aftermath was almost always devastating for the rebels, with mass executions and renewed oppression, and that changes were more a result of broader economic shift than direct consequences of the revolts. It's a bit like debating whether throwing a tantrum as a child ever really gets you what you want, or if it just makes your parents more determined. The truth is probably a mix, with some small victories carved out of immense suffering. You march with the growing throng, the rhythmic thud of their boots on the muddy road echoing the beat of your own heart. The air crackles with a strange mix of fear and exhilaration.
You see faces etched with years of hardship, but now alight with a fierce, desperate hope.
They chant slogans, simple but powerful, demanding justice, fairer taxes, and an end to their
servitude.
The sheer number of them is overwhelming, a human tide rising against the established order. You pass by fields left untended, homes abandoned, as entire communities join the swelling ranks of the rebellion. It's a collective act of defiance, a desperate gamble for a better future, or at least an end to the present misery. Another light joke. You know, I bet the medieval lords, sitting in their cozy castles, probably thought these peasant revolts were just a phase.
Oh, they'll get tired eventually. It's almost harvest season. They'll need to get back to work. And besides, who's going to feed them?
They didn't pack enough snacks for a revolution.
Because clearly, the most important thing during a rebellion is proper hydration.
And a good supply of artisanal cheeses. The targets of these peasant uprisings were often symbolic. Manor houses, tax collectors' offices, legal documents detailing feudal obligations, and sometimes the persons of the lords themselves or their hated officials. The destruction was often swift and brutal, a cathartic release of years of pent-up anger. Buildings would be torched, records burned, and those associated with the oppressive system might face summary justice. This wasn't just about property damage. It was about dismantling the very symbols of their subjugation, erasing the evidence of their bondage. It was a desperate attempt to reset the clock, to wipe the slate clean, and to reclaim a dignity that had been systematically denied. To them, one more light joke.
I imagine the medieval equivalent of a protest sign was just a very angry drawing of a pitchfork sticking into a tax collector.
And probably a lot of misspelled words because, you know, literacy wasn't exactly widespread. But the message was clear: no more taxes, and also, learn to spell. The motivations for these revolts were deeply personal. Imagine being forced to pay a tax on every loaf of bread you bake, or every chicken you raise, even when your own
family is starving. Imagine watching your children sicken and die from hunger, while your lord feasts in luxury. These were not abstract political grievances. They were matters of life and death, of survival and dignity. The violence, while shocking to our modern sensibilities, was often a direct response to the systemic violence and oppression they had endured for generations.
It was a desperate cry for recognition, a demand to be treated as human beings, not just as chattel fodder as the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the burning manor house. You realize the immense courage, and perhaps folly, of these peasant rebels. They knew the risks, the almost certain retribution that would follow, yet they rose.
Their actions, though often ending in tragedy, sent shockwaves through the medieval world, forcing the powerful to at least acknowledge the existence
of the powerless. The memory of their fury, their desperate struggle for a better life, would echo through the centuries, a stark reminder that even the most oppressed can, and will, eventually rise. And you, my friend, have just witnessed the raw, untamed power of the peasants' fury.
Last time, you witnessed the raw, desperate fury of peasant uprisings, shaking the very foundations of the feudal system.
But the medieval world wasn't just about muddy fields and burning manors.
As towns and cities grew, becoming centers of
trade, craft, and burgeoning wealth, they too became cauldrons of discontent. Now, You're about to experience the chaos of urban revolts as artisans, merchants, and the urban poor demand their rights, often with a ferocity that rivaled, and sometimes surpassed, their rural counterparts. Imagine stepping into a bustling, medieval city, perhaps Florence, Ghent, or London. The narrow, winding streets are choked with people. They are thick with the smell of commerce, human waste, and simmering resentment. Unlike the dispersed peasant communities, urban populations live cheek by jowl, their grievances amplified by close proximity and shared hardship. Here, the targets weren't just feudal lords, but corrupt city officials, oppressive guilds, or greedy patricians who controlled trade and wealth. You see artisans, their hands calloused from years of labor, now gripping not tools of their trade, but improvised weapons. Merchants, usually concerned with profit, now demand justice. This is a different kind of uprising, one born of the crowded, competitive, and often brutal realities of urban life. It's like a city-wide flash mob, but instead of a choreographed dance, it's a spontaneous riot. And the stakes are much, much higher. Mainstream historical fact: medieval urban uprisings were a common feature of the late Middle Ages, often driven by economic hardship, social inequality, and political grievances within the burgeoning city-states and towns. These revolts frequently involved a broader cross-section of society than purely peasant rebellions, including artisans, journeymen, small merchants, and the urban poor, who challenged the authority of patrician elites, corrupt magistrates, or oppressive guild masters. Examples include the Siampi Revolt in Florence 1378 and numerous uprisings in the textile towns of Flanders. One quirky tidbit about these urban revolts is how quickly they could escalate from a minor dispute to full-blown rebellion. A simple argument over market prices, a perceived injustice by a city official, or a new, unpopular tax could ignite a powder keg of pent-up frustration. The dense urban environment, with its narrow streets and close-knit communities, facilitated rapid communication and mobilization. News, rumors, and calls to action spread like wildfire through taverns, workshops, and market squares. It's like a medieval Twitter storm. But instead of angry tweets, you get angry mobs, and the consequences are significantly more immediate and violent, and probably a lot less character-limited, which, let's be honest, is sometimes a good thing. Historians still argue whether urban revolts were primarily economic in nature, driven by issues of wages, prices, and taxation, or if they also represented a deeper struggle for political participation and social recognition by the non-elite classes. Some scholars emphasize the material conditions that push people to rebellion, such as famine, plague, and economic downturns. Others contend that these uprisings were also about challenging the established power structures, demanding a voice in city governance, and asserting the dignity of labor. It's a bit like debating whether a modern protest is about the cost of living or about systemic inequality. The truth is likely a complex interplay, with economic grievances often providing the immediate trigger, but deeper social and political aspirations fueling the sustained unrest. You find yourself swept up in the surging crowd, the roar of their voices echoing off the timber-framed buildings. The air is thick with dust, shouts, and the metallic tang of fear. You see shopkeepers hastily barring their doors, while others, emboldened, jointly throng. The target might be the city hall, where the hated tax rolls are kept, or the mansion of a particularly despised merchant. Unlike the open fields of a peasant revolt, urban uprisings were often fought in confined spaces, turning narrow alleys into deadly choke points. Barricades might be hastily erected from carts, furniture, and anything else at hand, transforming familiar streets into battlegrounds. It's a terrifying, claustrophobic experience, a visceral demonstration of collective rage unleashed within the very heart of civilization. Another light joke. You know, I bet medieval city guards had a very specific kind of nightmare. Not about dragons, but about 1,000 angry bakers with rolling pins, because when the people who make your bread get mad, you know you're in deep trouble, and probably a lot less likely to get a discount on your next baguette. The motivations for urban unrest were often tied to the specific dynamics of city life. Guilds, while providing structure, could also be oppressive, limiting access to trades and controlling prices. The influx of rural migrants seeking work often strained resources and created a large, disenfranchised labor pool. And the constant Threat of disease in crowded conditions, exacerbated by poor sanitation, added another layer of misery. When a new tax was levied, or a powerful merchant hoarded grain, the collective anger could ignite instantly.
This wasn't just about survival.
It was about fairness, about the right to earn a living, and about having a say in the rules that govern their lives. It was a demand for dignity in the face of systemic exploitation. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a protest chant was something like, "What do we want? Fair bread prices.
When do we want it?
Before we starve. What's our plan B? Torches and pitchforks."
Very direct, those medieval protesters. No room for ambiguity. The violence of urban revolts could be particularly brutal.
Buildings were
sacked, property destroyed, and individuals associated with the oppressive regime might be dragged from their homes and subjected to summary justice.
The narrow streets and close quarters meant that escape was difficult, and the intensity of the conflict was often magnified. Yet, despite the risks, people continued to rise. The stakes were too high, the grievances too deep to remain silent. These uprisings, though often suppressed with extreme cruelty, sent a clear message to the ruling elites. The urban masses, though seemingly powerless, possessed a collective strength that could, and would, challenge the established order. As the sounds of the riot begin to subside, replaced by the crackle of distant fires and the wails of the injured, you realize the immense courage and desperation that fueled these urban uprisings. They were not just random acts of violence, but
desperate cries for justice, born from the harsh realities of medieval city life.
The memory of their fury, their struggle for a voice, would echo through the centuries, a stark reminder that even in the most crowded and controlled environments, the human spirit, when pushed too far, will find a way to rebel. And you, my friend, have just witnessed the chaotic, visceral power of the urban uprising. You've witnessed the raw, desperate fury of peasants and the chaotic energy of urban dwellers rising up against their earthly oppressors.
But in the medieval world, grievances weren't always about taxes or feudal dues.
Sometimes the most potent and terrifying protests were ignited by something far more profound, fervent religious belief. Now, you're about to encounter protests fueled by spiritual conviction, leading to movements that could be both inspiring and terrifying, from crusades to persecutions, all in the name of God. Imagine a dusty crossroads, where a charismatic preacher, perhaps a wandering friar or a self-proclaimed prophet, addresses a crowd.
His words are not about earthly injustices, but about divine wrath, about the corruption of the church, or the coming of the apocalypse.
He speaks of a world turned upside down, where the rich oppress the poor, and the clergy have strayed from
true piety. His message resonates deeply with people already suffering from famine, plague, and war, who see these calamities as signs of God's displeasure.
This isn't just a sermon.
It's a call to action, a spiritual awakening that can
quickly morph into a violent uprising.
It's like a medieval revival meeting, but instead of just finding salvation, you might find yourself marching on Rome.
And probably with a lot less singing, and a lot more righteous anger. Mainstream historical fact. Religious zealotry played a significant role in numerous medieval protests and movements, often providing a powerful ideological framework for challenging existing social and political orders. Examples range from the Children's Crusade, though its historical accuracy is debated. It reflects the popular belief in religiously motivated mass movements to various heretical movements like Eid Cathars or the Hussites, whose theological
dissent often led to armed conflict and widespread social unrest. These movements were not just about faith.
They were often intertwined with social grievances, offering a vision of a more just, divinely ordained society. One quirky tidbit about these religiously motivated protests is the belief in divine intervention. Many participants genuinely believed
that God was on their side, and that their actions, however violent, were sanctioned by heaven. This conviction could lead to astonishing acts of bravery or terrifying acts of cruelty, as they felt they were merely instruments of God's will.
Imagine marching into battle, convinced that angels are fighting alongside you, or that your enemies are literally agents of the devil. It certainly changes your perspective on a fair fight.
It's like having a divine cheat code, but for real life.
Holy wars, and probably a lot less fun for the other side. Historians still argue whether these religiously fueled protests were genuine expressions of popular piety and a desire for spiritual reform, or if religious rhetoric was primarily used by leaders to mobilize discontented masses for more secular political or economic aims. Some scholars emphasize the deep spiritual yearning and genuine belief in apocalyptic prophecies that drove many of these movements.
Others contend that opportunistic leaders often exploited religious fervor to gain power or advance their own agendas, skillfully weaving social grievances into a divine narrative.
It's a bit like debating whether a politician's faith is genuine or just a convenient way to rally the base. The truth is likely a complex interplay, with genuine belief often coexisting with and being manipulated by worldly ambitions. You find yourself swept up in a procession, not of pilgrims, but of protesters. They carry not just crosses and banners,
but also swords, clubs, and improvised weapons. Their eyes burn with a fierce conviction, a certainty that they are doing God's work.
The chants are prayers, but they are also war cries.
You might be marching towards a city accused of heresy, or joining a peasant army inspired by a radical priest who preaches equality in the eyes of God. The air is thick with a sense of destiny, a belief that the old order is crumbling and a new, divinely sanctioned world is about to be born.
It's a terrifying, exhilarating experience, a visceral demonstration of faith transformed into collective action, often with devastating consequences.
Another light joke. You know, I bet medieval inquisitors had a very specific kind of headache.
Not from too much wine, but from trying to figure out if someone was genuinely a heretic, or just really bad at explaining their theological views. And then they'd probably just default to heretic to be safe.
Because it's always better to be safe than sorry, especially when eternal damnation is on the line. The targets of these religious protests were often perceived enemies of the faith, heretics, Jews, or sometimes even the established church
hierarchy itself, accused of corruption and worldliness. The violence could be extreme, driven by a conviction that they were purifying the world, rooting out evil, and preparing for the second coming.
Massacres, forced conversions, and the destruction of property were not uncommon.
This wasn't just about political power.
It was about spiritual purity, about enforcing what they believed to be God's law on earth.
It was a terrifying manifestation of absolute conviction,
a reminder that faith, when untempered by compassion, can be a destructive force. One more
light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a protest sign at a religious uprising was something like, "Repent,
or we'll make you repent."
And also, "Your theology is unsound." Very persuasive, those medieval zealots.
No room for nuanced debate. The Crusades themselves, while often framed as military expeditions, also contained elements of mass popular protest. The People's Crusade, for instance, was largely a spontaneous, disorganized movement of peasants and commoners, fueled by fervent religious enthusiasm and a desire to liberate the Holy Land.
Their journey was marked by violence, looting, and persecution of Jewish communities along the way, highlighting the dark side of unchecked religious fervor.
These were not disciplined armies, but desperate masses, driven by a powerful, often apocalyptic, vision.
It was a pilgrimage, but with swords and a very strong sense of divine entitlement. As the echoes of fervent chants fade into the distance, replaced by the chilling silence of a town purge in the name of God, you realize the immense power and danger of religious zealotry.
It could inspire incredible acts of devotion and self-sacrifice, but also unleash unimaginable cruelty. These protests, born from a deep spiritual conviction, reshaped the medieval world, leaving a legacy of both profound faith and devastating violence.
And you, my friend, have just witnessed the terrifying transformation when fervent religious beliefs ignite into a fiery, unstoppable force. You've witnessed the terrifying power of religious fervor, capable of igniting crusades and persecutions.
But now, prepare yourself for a different kind of catalyst, one that reshaped the very fabric of medieval society and, in its wake, unleashed
a wave of demands for radical change and protest.
We're talking about the Black Death, a plague so devastating it wiped out a third to half of Europe's population, and in doing so, inadvertently handed the surviving common folk a power they'd
never known. You're about to see how this apocalyptic event, far from simply bringing despair, became a strange, grim engine of social upheaval. Imagine the silence, not the quiet of a peaceful night, but the eerie, suffocating silence of abandoned villages, of fields left untended, of bustling towns suddenly hushed. The air,
once thick with the sounds of life, now carries only the faint, sickly, sweet scent of death. You walk through streets where every third, or even every second, door stands empty, a chilling testament to the plague's indiscriminate hunger. But amidst this devastation, a strange new reality begins to emerge.
With so many gone, the value of those who remained, the laborers, the farmers, the artisans, skyrocketed.
Suddenly, your hands, once tied to the land by feudal obligation, held a new kind of power, scarcity. This wasn't a protest born of ideology, but of pure, brutal economics. It's like a massive, tragic reset button for the entire continent.
And suddenly, the supply and demand curve for human labor just went through the roof.
And you, my friend, are one of the few remaining commodities, mainstream historical fact. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, caused a catastrophic demographic collapse, reducing the population by an estimated 30–50. This massive loss of life led to a severe labor shortage across all sectors of society.
Consequently, the surviving peasants and laborers found themselves in an unprecedented position of leverage, able to demand higher wages, better working conditions, and greater freedoms from their lords, directly challenging the traditional feudal system and sparking numerous revolts when these demands were resisted. One quirky tidbit about this sudden shift in power is how some peasants, emboldened by their
newfound value, began to demand luxuries that would have been unthinkable just years before. Imagine a serf who once barely scraped by, now refusing to work unless he was provided with, say, a new pair of shoes, or perhaps even a small plot of land for his own use, free from feudal dues. There are even accounts of laborers refusing
to work for less than a certain wage, something unheard of in the rigid feudal hierarchy.
It's like suddenly finding out you're the last person on earth who knows how to fix Wi-Fi, and you can charge whatever you want,
and probably demand a very specific brand of artisanal cheese as payment.
Because why not?
You're essential.
Now, historians still argue whether the Black Death primarily led to economic changes, such as the eventual decline of serfdom and the rise of a wage-based economy, or if it also fostered a new sense of social consciousness and demands for fundamental
rights among the common people. Some scholars emphasize the purely economic forces at play, arguing that the labor shortage inevitably led to higher wages and greater mobility, regardless of any underlying ideological shifts.
Others contend that the shared experience of such
a devastating plague, and the realization that everyone, from peasant to king, was equally vulnerable, fostered a new sense of collective identity and a willingness to challenge the established order on moral and social grounds. It's a bit like debating whether a major natural disaster brings out the best in humanity, or just rearranges the economic deck chairs.
The truth is likely a complex interplay, with economic opportunity meeting a burgeoning sense of self-worth. You feel the subtle shift in the air, and newfound confidence among the survivors. The fear of the plague is slowly being replaced by a different kind of fear in the eyes of the lords and landowners. The fear of an empty field, an unworked mill, a harvest left to rot. You hear stories of peasants abandoning their traditional
manners, seeking better terms elsewhere, or simply refusing to work for the old, meager wages. The old rules are breaking down, not with a bang, but with the quiet, determined footsteps of those who realize their labor is now worth more than their lord's decree.
It's a silent revolution, played out in the fields and workshops, a slow, inexorable turning of the tables.
And you, my friend, are witnessing the dawn of a new kind of power, another light joke. You know, I bet some medieval lords, after the Black Death, started offering employee benefits. Yes, my good serf, not only will I pay you a shilling a day, but I'll also throw in a slightly used tunic and a promise not to execute your entire family for minor infractions.
What a deal! Because suddenly, good help was really, really hard to find, and much harder to replace. The attempts by the ruling class to resist these changes often led directly to violent protests. Governments and lords, accustomed to their absolute authority, tried to enforce old labor laws, fix wages at plague levels, and prevent peasants from leaving their manors. These attempts, like the Statute of Labourers in England, were met with fierce resistance.
The peasants, having tasted a glimpse of freedom and prosperity, were not willing to return to the old ways.
This clash between the old order and the new Reality ignited many of the major peasant revolts you've heard about, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England and the Jacquerie in France.
The plague didn't just kill people.
It killed the old social contract, and the ensuing struggle was often bloody. One warlike joke: I imagine the medieval equivalent of a human resources department after the Black Death was just a very stressed out lord, frantically trying to convince the last remaining peasant that working for him was a growth opportunity, and probably failing miserably. Because when you're the only one left, you said the terms. The Black Death also had a profound psychological impact, fostering a sense of fatalism, but also a questioning of authority, both secular and religious.
If God could allow such a catastrophe, what did it say about the established order?
This existential crisis, combined with the economic empowerment of the survivors, created a fertile ground for radical ideas and direct action. People were less afraid of challenging authority when death had already walked so closely among them.
The plague stripped away many illusions, revealing the raw power dynamics beneath the surface of medieval society.
It was a harsh lesson, but one that ultimately empowered the common person in ways no previous protest had. As the sun sets, casting long shadows over the recovering land, you realize the profound, albeit tragic, legacy of the Black Death.
It
was a cataclysm that brought immense suffering, but also an unexpected liberation.
It showed that even in the most rigid of societies, change could be forced not just by the will of kings, but by the sheer brutal force of circumstance. The protests that followed were not just reactions to hardship, they were the desperate,
violent birth pangs of a new social order, forged in the crucible of plague, and fueled by the newfound power of the common person.
And you, my friend, have just witnessed how a global pandemic led to demands for radical change that shook the
medieval world to its core.
You've witnessed the devastating impact of the Black Death, a grim catalyst that empowered the common folk and fueled their demands for change.
Now, let's turn our attention to a group whose role in these tumultuous times is often overlooked, yet whose presence on the barricades was both surprising and profoundly significant: women.
You're about to discover the often unseen yet vital contributions of women in medieval protests, proving that the fight for justice was far from a male-only affair. Imagine a scene of chaos, perhaps a city street during an urban uprising, or a village square during a peasant revolt. Amidst the shouting men, the flying stones, and the clash of improvised weapons, you see them, women. They are not merely bystanders,
they are active participants.
You see a woman, perhaps a baker's wife, her hands dusted with flour, now wielding a rolling pin with surprising ferocity. Another, a farmer's daughter, her face grim, helps to dismantle a cart to build a barricade. You might even see older women, their faces etched with years of hardship, urging on the younger generation, their voices sharp with a lifetime of accumulated grievances.
This isn't just about supporting their men.
This is about their own survival,
their own dignity, and their own desperate fight for a better life. It's like a medieval flash mob, but instead of dancing, they're demanding justice, and they're not afraid to get their hands dirty.
And probably a lot more organized than you'd expect. Mainstream historical fact: while historical narratives often focus on male leaders and participants, women played a significant and active role in many medieval popular revolts, including peasant uprisings and urban insurrections.
Their involvement ranged from direct participation in violent acts, such as stone throwing and property destruction, to crucial logistical support, like providing food and tending to the wounded, and even acting as instigators or moral leaders,
particularly when issues directly affected their households or communities. One quirky tidbit about women's participation is how their perceived irrationality or emotionality was sometimes used as a cover for more deliberate acts
of protest. A woman's outburst, particularly if it involved public shaming or verbal abuse of an official, might be dismissed as mere feminine hysteria, allowing her to escape harsher punishment than a man committing the same act.
This could be a deliberate tactic, a way to push boundaries and express dissent under the guise of being just a woman. It's like a medieval version of weaponized incompetence, but instead of avoiding chores, they're avoiding jail time for inciting a riot. And probably a lot more effective than feigning a headache. Historians still argue whether women's participation in medieval protests was primarily a reactive response to immediate threats to their families and livelihoods, or if it also represented
a nascent form of gender consciousness and a desire for greater agency within a patriarchal society.
Some scholars emphasize that women's roles were often extensions of their domestic responsibilities, protecting their homes and children from economic hardship or injustice. Others contend that their active presence in public acts of defiance, often alongside men, challenged traditional gender roles and demonstrated a collective assertion of their rights as members of the community beyond their domestic sphere. It's a bit like debating whether a mother protesting school closures is doing it just for her kids, or if she's also fighting for her own right to have a say in public policy.
The truth is likely a complex interplay with immediate needs,
Often intertwining with broader aspirations for justice and recognition. You see women at the forefront of the action, their voices rising above the din. They might be throwing stones from rooftops or emptying chamber pots onto hated officials passing below. They might be tearing down fences or ransacking granaries to seize hoarded grain. Their targets were often those who directly impacted
their daily lives. The tax collector who demanded too much, the merchant who hoarded food, or the official who enforced unjust laws.
Their anger was visceral, born from the constant struggle to feed their families and protect their homes. This wasn't abstract politics. This was about survival, about the very real threat of starvation and destitution.
It was a fight for their children's future, and they were willing to do whatever it took. Another light joke. You know, I bet medieval men were sometimes a little intimidated by the women during these protests. Darling, I know you're upset about the new bread tax, but do you really need to sharpen that rolling pin that much?
It's starting to look less like a kitchen utensil and more like a weapon of mass destruction.
Because when a woman is truly determined, even a knight in shining armor might think twice. Women's involvement was not limited to direct confrontation. They played crucial logistical roles often overlooked in historical accounts. They would organize food and drink for the protesters, tend to the wounded, and provide shelter for those on the run. They also serve as vital conduits of information, spreading news and rumors through their social networks, often more effectively than men, who might be under closer surveillance. Their ability to move between public and private spheres, between the marketplace and the home, made them invaluable in sustaining and coordinating rebellions. It's like they were the medieval equivalent of the unsung heroes of a protest movement, the ones who make sure everyone is fed, patched up, and knows what's happening next. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a protest banner made by women would be something like, "We're not just pretty faces.
We also have pitchforks,
and we know how to use them."
Very empowering, those medieval women,
and probably very effective at getting their point across. In some instances, women even emerge as leaders or symbolic figures. While less common than male leaders, there are accounts of women inspiring or directing actions, particularly in localized protests where their personal grievances were deeply felt.
Their presence also added a moral dimension to the protests, making it harder for authorities to dismiss the rebels as mere criminals. The sight of women, often seen as the weaker sex, rising up in defiance, was a powerful symbol of the depth of popular discontent and the injustice of the ruling powers.
It was a visual indictment of a system that had pushed even the most vulnerable to desperate measures. As the sounds of the protest begin to fade, and the women return to their homes, their faces grim but resolute, you realize the profound impact of their often unacknowledged contributions. They were not just wives, mothers, or daughters.
They were active agents of change, fighting for their rights and the future of their communities.
Their courage, their resourcefulness, and their sheer determination were as vital to the medieval protests as any sword or banner.
And you, my friend, have just witnessed the surprising and often overlooked role of women on the barricades, proving that history is always more complex and more inspiring than it first appears. You've witnessed the raw power of peasant fury and the chaotic energy of urban uprisings, fueled by desperation and a thirst for justice.
But a mob, however angry, often needs a voice, a direction, a figure to rally around.
Now, you're about to meet the charismatic, and sometimes ruthless, figures who emerge from the ranks of the common folk to lead these revolts, transforming scattered grievances into organized, albeit often short-lived, movements that shook the medieval world. Imagine a dusty village square, or a crowded city market, where a man stands on an overturned cart, his voice cutting through the din. He might be a humble artisan, a disillusioned priest, or a former soldier, but his words carry an undeniable power. He articulates the unspoken grievances, gives voice to the silent suffering, and paints a vivid picture of a better world, free from oppression.
You see the faces in the crowd, once sullen and defeated, now alight with a fierce hope, their eyes fixed on this unlikely leader.
This isn't a king or a noble, this is one of their own. A man who understands their plight because
he shares it.
This is Wat Tyler, or perhaps Jack Cade, or any one of the countless figures who dared to challenge the established order. It's like watching a grassroots movement find its reluctant yet compelling spokesperson, but with significantly more risk of being drawn and quartered, and probably a lot less media training. Mainstream historical fact: many significant medieval
popular revolts were led by charismatic figures who emerged from the common populace, rather than the nobility or established clergy. These leaders, such as Wat Tyler in the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, often possessed strong oratorical skills and a deep understanding of the grievances of their followers, enabling them to mobilize large numbers of people and direct the
rebellion, even if their ultimate goals and methods varied widely. One quirky tidbit about these leaders is how often they adopted symbolic names or titles, or were given them by their followers, that reflected their humble origins or their revolutionary
aspirations.
Wat Tyler, for instance, was a common name, but it became synonymous with rebellion.
Other leaders might be known by their trade, like John the Miller, or by a nickname that captured their fiery spirit. It's like a medieval superhero origin story, but instead of a cape, they get a pitchfork, and instead of a secret lair, they have a burning manor house.
And probably a lot less spandex, which, let's be honest, is a good thing for everyone involved. Historians still argue whether these leaders were genuine revolutionaries with a coherent vision for a new social order, or if they were primarily opportunistic figures who capitalized on existing discontent for personal gain or fleeting power. Some scholars emphasize their radical rhetoric and the transformative potential of their demands, suggesting they were precursors to later revolutionary movements. Others contend that their goals were often limited to specific grievances, such
as tax relief or the abolition of serfdom, and that their leadership was more reactive than ideologically driven. It's a bit like debating whether a popular band is a true artistic visionary or just really good at playing catchy tunes.
The truth is likely a complex blend, with genuine conviction often intertwined with the practicalities of leading a desperate uprising. You follow this leader as he moves through the swelling ranks of the rebels. He doesn't command with the
authority of a knight, but with the raw power of conviction.
He listens to grievances, offers words of encouragement, and makes promises of a better future.
You see him making difficult decisions, sometimes ruthless ones, to maintain order within
the chaotic mob, or to punish those who betray the cause.
He is both a symbol and a strategist, a beacon of hope and a harbinger of destruction. The weight of thousands of desperate lives rests on his shoulders, and you can feel the immense pressure, the constant threat of betrayal or defeat.
It's a precarious position, a tightrope walk between inspiring loyalty and inviting assassination, another light joke. You know, I bet medieval rebel leaders had a very specific kind of job interview. So, your resume says you're good at rallying angry mobs and have a strong aversion to taxes. Any experience with strategic castle sieges? No?
Well, we can train you. Just try not to get captured before lunch, because in the medieval world, career progression was often very, very rapid and very, very dangerous. The backgrounds of these leaders were as varied as the revolts themselves.
Some were peasants, like Wat Tyler, who rose from obscurity to lead a national rebellion. Others were disaffected members of the lower clergy, like John Ball, whose sermons provided a theological justification for social rebellion. In urban uprisings,
leaders might come from the ranks of master craftsmen or small merchants, frustrated by the dominance of the patrician elite. What united them was not their social standing, but their ability to articulate the widespread discontent and to inspire collective action.
They were the accidental heroes or villains of their time, thrust into leadership by the sheer force
of popular will. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a leadership seminar for rebel leaders was just a very intense session on how to avoid getting stabbed in the back by your own followers.
And probably a brief lesson on how to look intimidating while covered in mud.
Because appearances, even in a rebellion, matter. The fate of these leaders was almost universally tragic. Most were captured, tortured, and executed with extreme brutality, serving as a grim warning to others who might dare to challenge authority.
Wat Tyler, for instance, was famously killed during negotiations with King Richard II.
Yet, even in death, their legacy often lived on, becoming martyrs for the cause, their names whispered in defiance for generations.
Their stories, though often ending in failure, became powerful symbols of resistance, inspiring future generations to continue the struggle for justice. It was a high-stakes game, and the odds were almost always stacked against them. As the sun sets, casting long shadows over the gallows where another rebel leader has met his end, you realize the immense courage and sacrifice of these figures.
They were not perfect, and their methods were often brutal, but they dared to dream of a world where the common person had a voice, where justice was not just a privilege of the powerful.
Their actions, though often ending in defeat,
left an indelible mark on the medieval world, proving that even the most oppressed can, and will, find a leader to guide their fury.
And you, my friend, have just met the charismatic, and sometimes ruthless, figures who emerge to lead the rabble, forever changing the course of history. You've met the charismatic leaders who rallied the discontented masses, transforming whispers into roars.
But a leader, however inspiring, is only as effective as the tools at their disposal. And in the medieval world, when the common folk
rose up, those tools were often not gleaming swords or polished lances, but the very implements of their daily lives, repurposed for a brutal new purpose. Now, you're about to learn about the improvised and often terrifyingly effective weapons used by protesters against armed authorities, turning everyday objects into instruments of rebellion. Imagine yourself in the thick of a medieval uprising. You're not handed a finely crafted longsword or a sturdy shield. Instead, you might find yourself gripping a pitchfork, its prongs, usually meant for hay, now menacingly pointed at a knight.
Or perhaps a scythe, its curved blade, typically used for harvesting grain, now sharpened to a razor's edge, capable of disemboweling a horse. You see others wielding flails, not for threshing wheat, but for crushing helmets, or axes, once used for felling trees, now cleaving through armor.
Even simple clubs, heavy stones, or sharpened stakes become deadly in the hands of a desperate mob.
This is the brutal ingenuity of necessity, where the tools of labor become the weapons of war. It's like a medieval DIY project, but instead of a birdhouse, you're building a revolution, and the stakes are, quite literally, life and death, mainstream.
Historical fact: medieval protesters, particularly peasants and urban commoners, rarely had access to professional military weaponry. Instead, they overwhelmingly relied on adapted farming implements, household tools, and improvised weapons.
Pitchforks, scythes, flails, axes, hammers, and even simple clubs were common, often modified to be more effective in combat. These tools,
while cruder compared to knightly arms, could be surprisingly effective in mass engagements, especially against poorly organized or outnumbered professional soldiers. One quirky tidbit about these improvised weapons is the psychological impact they had. Imagine a heavily armored knight, accustomed to facing other knights with similar weaponry, suddenly confronted by a wave of enraged peasants wielding tools that symbolized their oppression.
The sight of 1,000 pitchforks glinting in the sun or the rhythmic thud of flails could be far more terrifying than a disciplined charge of cavalry.
It wasn't just the physical threat, it was the symbolic inversion of power. The very instruments of their servitude turned against their masters. It's like being attacked by your own kitchen utensils, but on a much, much larger and more violent scale. And probably a lot less funny when it's happening to you. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these improvised weapons lay primarily in their sheer numbers and the overwhelming force of the mob, or if the protesters developed surprisingly sophisticated tactics for their use, maximizing their brutal potential. Some scholars emphasize that the sheer weight of numbers, combined with the element of surprise and the desperation of the rebels, was the primary factor in
their initial successes.
Others contend that there was an unwritten, perhaps even instinctive, understanding of how to use these tools in a chaotic melee, turning their agricultural design into a surprisingly efficient killing machine.
It's a bit like debating whether
a swarm of bees is effective because there are so many of them, or because they all know how to sting in unison. The truth is likely a combination, with desperation providing the impetus and collective action providing the force. You feel the rough wood of a pitchfork in your hands, its weight familiar, yet its purpose utterly transformed. The air is filled with the shouts of your comrades, the clang of metal, and the terrified screams of those who stand against you. You swing, not with the practiced grace of a trained warrior, but with the raw, untamed power of years of manual labor, fueled by a lifetime of injustice. The improvised nature of these weapons means every blow is a desperate gamble, every parry a prayer. You see a fellow rebel, his face grim, bring down a modified flail, its spiked head a blur of destruction.
Another uses a sharpened shovel to hack at the legs of a charging horse. There's no finesse here, only brutal efficiency, born of desperation and a burning desire for retribution. Another light joke. You know, I bet medieval armorers had a very specific kind of existential crisis during these revolts.
All this expensive plate mail, all these years of training, and I'm being taken down by a guy with a glorified gardening tool. My life, I say, lie.
Because sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective, especially when they're wielded by
1,000 angry hands. The lack of formal training with these weapons also meant that the fighting was often chaotic and brutal.
There were no elaborate formations or complex maneuvers.
It was a desperate, swirling melee. Yet, this very chaos could be an advantage. Overwhelming disciplined soldiers who were accustomed to more conventional warfare. The sheer ferocity of
the attack, the relentless, unyielding pressure of a mob that had nothing left to lose, could break even the most seasoned ranks. The protesters fought not for glory, but for survival, for justice, and for a chance at a better life. And that made them terrifyingly effective. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a tactical briefing for the authorities. Facing these rebels was something like, okay, so they have pitchforks
and scythes. And is that a really angry baker with a rolling pin? Right, well, just try not to get impaled. Or baked. Good luck, lads.
Because sometimes the enemy
you face is just too unpredictable for any textbook strategy. The use of fire was also a common and devastating tactic.
Torches, burning brands, and flaming arrows could turn wooden buildings into infernos, creating chaos and panic. This wasn't just about destruction. It was about sending a message, about striking at the heart of the oppressive system.
The burning
manor house, the sacked city hall, became potent symbols of rebellion, visible for miles around, inspiring others to join the cause. The smoke and flames were not just physical elements of the protest. They were visual declarations of war, painting the landscape with the fury of the common folk. As the sounds of battle begin to subside, and the improvised weapons lie scattered amidst the wreckage, you realize the immense courage and desperation that drove these protesters.
They faced trained soldiers, often with superior arms, yet they fought with what they had, turning their everyday tools into symbols of defiance.
Their brutal ingenuity, born of necessity, left an indelible mark on the medieval world, proving
that even the most oppressed, when pushed to their limits, can find the means to fight back. And you, my friend, have just witnessed the terrifying power of the weapons of the uprising, forged not in a smithy, but in the crucible of injustice. You've seen the improvised weapons, the raw fury of the mob, and the charismatic leaders who emerged from the shadows.
Now, the rebellion has reached its zenith, and the targets are no longer just manor houses or city halls.
The ultimate symbols of power, the impregnable fortresses of the nobility, stand defiant. You're about to witness the desperate attempts to breach these fortified strongholds, often with tragic results, as the common folk, armed with little more than courage and crude tools, lay siege to the very bastions of medieval authority.
Imagine standing before the towering walls of a medieval castle, its stone ramparts seemingly mocking your efforts. The air is thick with tension, the shouts of the besiegers echoing against the cold stone. You see thousands of rebels, a human
tide, surrounding the fortress, cutting off its supplies and attempting to starve out its defenders.
But this isn't a professional army with siege engines and engineers.
This is a desperate populace.
You might see them attempting to scale walls with hastily constructed ladders, or trying to undermine foundations with picks and shovels. Flaming
arrows arc through the sky, aimed at wooden structures within the castle, hoping to ignite a blaze. The defenders, from their vantage points, rain down arrows, stones, and boiling liquids, turning the ground below into a deadly killing field.
It's a brutal, drawn-out affair, a test of wills between the entrenched power and the surging desperation.
It's like trying to knock down a skyscraper with a sledgehammer, but with significantly more danger of being hit by a falling gargoyle, and probably a lot less health and safety regulations, mainstream historical fact, while peasant and urban.
Revolts rarely succeeded in capturing heavily fortified castles or major cities for extended periods. They frequently attempted to lay siege to such strongholds. These sieges, though often lacking the sophisticated siege weaponry of professional armies, aimed to cut off supplies, starve out defenders, or force negotiations through sheer numbers and persistent pressure.
Notable examples include the attempts
By rebels during the Peasants' Revolt to capture the Tower of London, which they briefly succeeded in entering, and various local castles across Europe. One quirky tidbit about these sieges is the use of psychological warfare by the rebels. They might parade captured officials or nobles before the castle walls, threatening their execution if the gates were not opened. They might sing mocking
songs or shout insults, attempting to demoralize the defenders. Sometimes they would even bring the families of the defenders to the walls, hoping to break their resolve.
It's like a medieval version of a very aggressive protest chant, but with significantly higher stakes and a much more captive audience.
And probably a lot less catchy tunes. Historians still argue whether these sieges, despite their low success rate, served a crucial purpose in demonstrating the rebels' resolve and forcing the authorities to take their demands seriously, or if they were largely symbolic acts of defiance that ultimately drained rebel resources and led to their inevitable defeat. Some scholars emphasize that even failed sieges sent a powerful message to the ruling elite about the depth of popular discontent and the potential for widespread unrest, often leading to concessions or reforms after the rebellion was suppressed.
Others contend that the military superiority of fortified positions made these attempts strategically unsound, diverting resources and manpower from more achievable goals, and ultimately contributing to the rebels' downfall.
It's a bit like
debating whether a bold, but ultimately unsuccessful, marketing campaign was a failure or a necessary step in building brand awareness.
the truth is likely a complex interplay, with symbolic power often clashing with military reality. You join the throng at the base of the castle walls, your neck craning to see the battlements high above. The air is filled with the whiz of arrows, the thud of stones, and the groans of the wounded.
You see men desperately trying to hack through the thick wooden gates with axes, while others attempt to fill the moat with rubble and debris. The sheer scale of the effort is astounding, a testament to the depth of their desperation.
But the
Castle, designed to withstand far more sophisticated attacks, holds firm.
each failed assault is met with a renewed volley from the defenders, thinning the rebel ranks and slowly eroding their morale.
It's a grueling, relentless struggle, a microcosm of the larger conflict between the powerful and the powerless.
Another light joke. You know, I bet medieval castle defenders had a very specific kind of morning routine during a siege.
All right, lads, time to pour some boiling oil on those peasants. And remember, aim for the ones with the really enthusiastic pitchforks. They're probably the leaders.
And try not to spill any on your new tunic. It's a nightmare to get out, because even during a siege, a knight has to maintain his standards. The lack of proper siege equipment was a major handicap for the rebels.
They rarely had access to trebuchets, catapults, or battering rams, the heavy machinery necessary to breach stone walls. Their attempts were often improvised, relying on sheer numbers and brute force rather than engineering prowess.
This meant that most sieges were prolonged affairs, turning into wars of attrition, where the rebels, lacking sustained supplies and discipline, were at a distinct disadvantage against a well-provisioned and determined garrison.
It was a battle of endurance, and the castle almost always had more of it. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a siege strategy meeting for the rebels was something like, "Okay, so we've tried throwing rocks."
And shouting really loudly. And that one guy tried to dig a tunnel with a spoon.
Any other brilliant ideas?
No? Right, well, let's just keep throwing rocks then.
Maybe they'll get bored, because sometimes persistence is all you have, even if it's a bit uninspired.
The tragic results of these sieges were almost inevitable.
When a castle finally fell, it was often due to internal betrayal or starvation rather than direct assault.
And when the rebellion was suppressed, the retribution was swift and brutal. Those who participated in the sieges, particularly those caught within the castle walls, faced summary execution, often by hanging or beheading, their bodies displayed as a warning to others.
Yet, despite the overwhelming odds and the grim consequences, the rebels continued to try.
The symbolic importance of capturing a lord's castle
of striking at the heart of their power was often worth the immense risk, even if it meant certain death as the sun sets, casting long shadows over the unyielding stone walls, and the sounds
of the siege slowly die down, replaced by the mournful cries of the wounded. You realize the immense courage and futility of these desperate attempts.
The castles stood as grim reminders of the power imbalance, but also as symbols of the rebels' unwavering defiance.
Their desperate attempts to breach these strongholds, though often ending in tragedy, left an indelible mark on the medieval landscape, proving that even the most formidable fortresses could not entirely quell the spirit of rebellion. And you, my friend, have just witnessed the desperate, often tragic, struggle to bring down the castles of power. You've witnessed the desperate attempts to breach the castles of power, the raw courage of the rebels, and the brutal ingenuity of their improvised weapons.
But as with any gamble, there's always a price to pay. And in the medieval world, when a rebellion failed, that price was almost always paid in blood, and with extreme cruelty.
Now, you're about to experience the swift and brutal vengeance exacted by authorities on defeated rebels, a chilling reminder of the power of the
king and the unforgiving nature of medieval justice. Imagine the aftermath.
The roar of the mob has been replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the grim commands of soldiers.
The fields and streets, once teeming with defiant rebels, are now littered with bodies, or filled with the terrified faces of those who have been captured. You see the king's banners, or the lord's standard, flying triumphantly over the very places that had dared to defy them. This isn't just about restoring order.
It's about sending a message, a brutal, undeniable declaration that rebellion will not be tolerated, and that the established hierarchy will be maintained at any cost.
It's like watching a very grim, very public lesson in obedience, where the blackboard is a gallows and the chalk is blood.
And probably a lot less effective at teaching long-term lessons, but very good at short-term terror. Mainstream historical fact: the suppression of medieval revolts was almost universally swift and exceptionally brutal.
Defeated rebels faced severe punishments, including mass executions, torture, mutilation, and the confiscation of their property. Leaders were often subjected to particularly gruesome forms of execution, such as hanging, drawing, and quartering, designed not only to inflict maximum suffering, but also to serve as a public spectacle and a deterrent to future uprisings.
The
scale of retribution was intended to reassert the absolute authority of the ruling class and to instill fear in the populace. One quirky tidbit about these retributions is the meticulous record-keeping that sometimes accompanied them.
Imagine scribes diligently noting down the names of the executed, the nature of their crimes, and the details of their gruesome deaths.
These records, far from being mere administrative tasks, served as official narratives, justifying the state's violence and reinforcing the idea that the rebels were not just criminals, but traitors against God and King. It's like a medieval version of a very dark bureaucratic process, where the paperwork is as chilling as the punishment itself.
And probably a lot less concerned with privacy laws. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality of these
retributions was a calculated strategy to prevent future revolts through terror, or if it was also an expression of genuine rage and a desire for vengeance on the part of the ruling elites who felt their authority had been personally affronted.
Some scholars emphasize their pragmatic aspect, arguing that the public display of such horrific punishments was a deliberate act of statecraft, designed to re-establish control and deter dissent.
Others contend that the emotional response of the
nobility, who had seen their lands ravaged and their power challenged, played a significant role in the severity of the reprisals.
It's a bit like debating whether a parent's harsh punishment is purely for discipline or also a result of their own frustration.
The truth is likely a complex interplay, with cold calculation often mixed with hot anger. You see the gallows being erected in the village square, or the city gates adorned with the heads of the executed.
The air is heavy with the stench of death
and the palpable fear of the survivors. You might witness a public execution, a grim spectacle designed to terrorize and subdue. The condemned, often still alive, are subjected to unimaginable torments, their bodies dismembered and displayed as a warning.
Families are dispossessed, their homes burned, their lands confiscated.
The message is clear: defy the king, defy the
Lord, and this will be your fate.
It's a chilling, visceral demonstration of absolute power, a reminder that the medieval world was not for the faint of heart. Another light joke. You know, I bet medieval executioners had a very specific kind
of job security.
Well, the rebellion failed, so I guess I'll be busy for the next few weeks. Good thing I sharpened my axe this morning and remembered to bring my extra large bucket, because in the medieval world, some jobs were just recession-proof. Even if they were a bit messy, the methods of punishment were varied, but all were designed to maximize suffering and public humiliation.
Hanging was common, but often combined with dragging the condemned to the gallows and quartering, dismembering the body. Beheadings were reserved for those of higher status, or as a swift end for particularly dangerous leaders.
Impalement,
burning at the stake, and various forms of mutilation were also employed, depending on the nature of the crime and the severity of the rebellion. These were not just legal sentences.
They were theatrical performances, carefully staged to reinforce the social hierarchy and the consequences of challenging it. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a public service announcement after a failed rebellion was something like, "Remember, folks, crime doesn't pay," especially when the payment involves being hung, drawn, and quartered.
So, maybe just stick to farming. It's less exciting, but significantly less fatal, because sometimes the best advice is also the most obvious. The impact of this retribution was profound and long-lasting.
While it often succeeded in quelling immediate unrest, it also sowed seeds of deep resentment and fear that could simmer for generations. The memory of these brutal suppressions became part of the collective consciousness, passed down through oral traditions and folk songs, serving as both a warning and a source of inspiration for future acts of defiance.
The authorities might have won the battle, but the war for the hearts and minds of the common people was far from over.
The scars of such violence ran deep, shaping the relationship between rulers and ruled for centuries to come. As the last cries fade into the night, and the grim work of the king's men continues, you realize the immense, terrifying power of retribution.
It was a dark, necessary chapter in the story of medieval protests, a stark reminder that the path to change was often paved with immense suffering and sacrifice. The sight of the defeated, the silence of the dead, and the fear in the eyes of
the living all speak volumes about the cost of rebellion, and you, my friend, have just witnessed the swift and brutal vengeance exacted by authorities on defeated rebels, a chilling testament to the unforgiving nature of medieval power. You've witnessed the brutal aftermath of failed rebellions, the swift and merciless retribution exacted by the king.
But even in the face of such overwhelming force, the spirit of dissent, like a stubborn weed, found ways to spread.
In a world without mass media, where literacy was a luxury, the seeds of rebellion were often sown not by grand pronouncements, but by whispers, by songs, and by hastily scrawled messages. Now, you're about to explore the subtle, yet powerful, ways in which pamphlets, songs, and rumors spread dissent across the medieval land, proving that the pen, or rather, the spoken word, could indeed be mightier than the sword. Imagine yourself in a bustling market square, or a crowded tavern. You hear a snatch of a song, its melody catchy, its lyrics subtly subversive, mocking the local lord or criticizing the king's latest tax.
Or perhaps a traveling minstrel ostensibly entertaining the crowd weaves a tale of a heroic commoner who defied injustice, a story that resonates deeply with the listeners. You might overhear hushed conversations, rumors spreading like wildfire about a new decree, a hidden injustice, or a call to arms from a distant village. These weren't official pronouncements. They were organic, grassroots forms of communication, bypassing the controlled channels of the powerful and speaking directly to the hearts and minds of the common folk. It's like a medieval social media network, but instead of hashtags, you have whispers, and instead of likes, you have a growing sense of shared outrage.
And probably a lot less cat videos, which, let's be honest, is a missed opportunity, mainstream historical fact, in the absence of widespread literacy and formal
communication networks. Medieval dissent was often propagated through oral traditions, including protest songs, satirical verses, and rumors. These forms of communication allowed grievances to be shared, solidarity to be built, and calls to action to be disseminated among the largely illiterate populace, often bypassing the censorship and control of the ruling authorities and the church. One quirky tidbit about these protest songs is how they often used allegory and coded language to avoid direct accusations and thus direct punishment. A song might speak of a greedy wolf preying on a flock of sheep, with everyone knowing the wolf represented the local lord and the sheep were the peasants. Or a seemingly innocent folk tale might carry a hidden message of rebellion.
This allowed for a degree of plausible deniability, while still effectively conveying the message of discontent.
It's like a medieval rap battle, but with more metaphors and less bling, and probably a lot less auto-tune, which, depending on
the minstrel, could be a good or bad thing. Historians still argue whether these forms of oral dissent were merely expressions of popular frustration,
or if they actively contributed to the organization and mobilization of revolts by fostering a collective identity and a shared sense of grievance.
Some scholars emphasize their role as a safety valve, allowing people to vent their anger without necessarily leading to direct action.
Others contend that by articulating grievances, building solidarity, and disseminating information, these songs and rumors played a crucial role in preparing the ground for, and even directly inciting, rebellion.
It's a bit like debating whether a protest song simply reflects the mood of the times or actively inspires people to march.
The truth is likely a complex interplay, with expression often leading to action, and action inspiring further expression. You find yourself humming a tune, its simple melody catchy, its words echoing your own frustrations.
You hear it sung by
others, in fields, in workshops, in taverns, a subtle thread of defiance weaving through the fabric of daily life. You realize the power of this shared narrative, this collective voice that transcends individual fear.
Rumors, too, become potent weapons.
A whispered tale of a lord's cruelty, or a king's weakness, can erode authority more effectively than
1,000 swords.
These informal networks of communication, often dismissed by the powerful as mere gossip, were in fact the lifeblood of medieval dissent, allowing ideas to spread faster than any royal decree.
It's a subtle, insidious form of rebellion, undermining the foundations of power one whisper at a time. Another light joke. I bet medieval spies had a very specific kind of job, not sneaking into castles, but hanging out in taverns,
trying to figure out if that catchy new folk song was actually a coded message for a rebellion.
And probably getting very drunk in the process.
Because sometimes, intelligence gathering requires a lot of ale, while less common due to low literacy rates. Pamphlets and written broadsides also played a role, particularly in urban areas or among
the more educated segments of society. These might be crudely printed or hand-copied, containing radical sermons, political manifestos, or satirical attacks on the ruling class.
They would be secretly distributed, posted in public places under
the cover of darkness, or read aloud to illiterate audiences.
These written forms of dissent, though limited in reach, offered a more direct and explicit challenge to authority, often articulating specific demands and grievances that could then be amplified through oral channels.
It was a slow burn, but
a powerful one. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a viral meme was just a really well-drawn caricature of the king with a pig's nose, secretly passed around from hand to hand.
And probably a lot of nervous laughter, because, treason was a serious offense.
But totally worth it for the laughs. The authorities were well aware of the power of these informal communication channels and often tried to suppress them.
Laws were passed against seditious speech, minstrels were sometimes interrogated, and those caught spreading rumors could face severe punishment.
Yet, these efforts were often futile. The very nature of oral communication, its fluidity and adaptability, made it almost impossible to control. A song could be changed, a rumor embellished, a message rephrased, constantly evolving to evade detection.
It was a cat-and-mouse game, played out in the shadows of medieval society, with the stakes being the very stability of the realm. As the last notes of a forbidden song fade into the night, and the echoes of a whispered rumor die down, you realize the immense, often underestimated, power of the word.
In a world where formal power resided with the few, the ability to communicate, to share grievances, and to inspire collective action through informal channels was a vital tool for the many.
These pamphlets, songs, and rumors, though seemingly insignificant, were the invisible threads that wove together the fabric of medieval dissent, preparing the ground for the next eruption of popular fury. And you, my friend, have just witnessed how the power of the word in its most subtle and subversive forms could challenge the might of kings and lords.
You've seen how whispers and songs could spread the seeds of dissent, undermining authority from within. But sometimes the fuse that lit the powder keg wasn't a subtle rumor or a coded melody.
It was a blunt, undeniable demand from the powerful.
More money.
Now, you're about to understand the oppressive financial burdens that often push people to their breaking point, turning quiet desperation into violent rebellion.
Because nothing quite unites a populace like a shared grievance over their hard-earned coin being taken away. Imagine yourself toiling in the fields, your back aching, your hands calloused, knowing that a significant portion of your meager harvest
Will go not to feed your family, but to your lord, or to the king's coffers.
or perhaps you're an artisan in a bustling town, struggling to make ends meet, only to be hit with a new levy on your trade, or a tax on every loaf of bread you bake. The medieval world was a labyrinth of taxes, tithes, and feudal dues, each one a burden on the common person. There were taxes on land, on livestock, on goods sold in the market, and even on the very act of existing.
You might pay a tallage to your lord, a tithe to the church, and various aids and scutages to the king.
It was a constant drain, a relentless chipping away at your already precarious existence.
It's like living in a world where every single thing you do, every breath you take, comes with a hidden fee, and the fine print is written in Latin, which you can't read,
And probably a lot less transparency than your average phone bill, which is saying something. Mainstream historical fact: taxation, particularly new or increased taxes, was a primary and recurring cause of popular revolts throughout the Middle Ages. The English poll taxes of the late 14th century, culminating in the deeply unpopular poll tax of 1,381,381, which levied a flat rate on every person regardless of wealth, directly triggered the peasants' revolt of 1381.
Similar tax-related uprisings occurred across Europe, as rulers sought to fund increasingly expensive wars and lavish courts, often pushing their subjects beyond their economic limits. One quirky
tidbit about these taxes is how inventive the authorities could be in finding new things to tax.
Beyond the obvious, there were taxes on salt, on windows, on hearts, and even on beards.
Imagine the outrage of a proud Viking descendant having to pay for his magnificent facial hair. It's like a medieval government trying to find every possible
loophole to extract money, and succeeding.
It's like they had a brainstorming session, and someone just kept shouting, "What else can we tax?"
The air they breathe, the thoughts in their heads, and probably a lot less concern for public opinion polls. Historians still argue whether the sheer burden of taxation was the sole or primary cause of these revolts, or if taxes merely served as a convenient trigger for deeper, pre-existing social and economic grievances. Some scholars emphasize the direct correlation between new or oppressive taxes and the outbreak of rebellion, arguing that the financial strain was the immediate breaking point. For many, others contend that while taxes were often the spark, the
underlying kindling was already present in the form of feudal oppression, social inequality, and a growing sense of injustice, which the taxes merely brought to a head. It's a bit like debating whether a match caused a forest fire, or if the dry tinder and strong winds were the real culprits. The truth is likely a complex interplay, with the tax often being the final straw that broke the camel's back, or,
in this case, the peasant spirit. You feel the weight of these burdens pressing down on you, a constant nagging anxiety.
every coin you earn, every bushel of grain you harvest, feels like it's already earmarked for someone else. You hear the grumbling in the market, the quiet curses muttered under breath when the tax collector makes his rounds.
The injustice is palpable. Why should you, who toil in the dirt, pay as much as the wealthy merchant, or even the lord himself?
The concept of fairness, so fundamental to human nature, is constantly violated by a system that seems designed to extract as much as possible from those who have the least.
It's a slow, grinding tyranny, far more insidious than any sudden act of violence, because it erodes your dignity day by day. Another light joke. You know, I bet medieval tax collectors had a very specific kind of job description.
Must be comfortable with being universally hated. Experience in dodging rotten vegetables and angry pitchforks a plus.
Strong bladder recommended, as bathroom breaks will be infrequent due to constant fleeing, because clearly it was a very glamorous profession beyond direct taxes. There were also the myriad feudal obligations. You might owe days of labor on the lord's domain, or be forced to use his mill to grind your grain, paying a fee for the privilege. You couldn't marry without the lord's permission, often requiring another payment. Even passing on your meager inheritance to your children might incur a death duty.
These were not just financial burdens, they were constant reminders of your
lack of freedom, your subservience to a system that controlled every aspect of your life. It was a form of economic tyranny, designed to keep you tied to the land and perpetually dependent. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a financial advisor was just a very old,
very cynical peasant who would tell you, just hide your chickens,
and maybe bury your coins under the biggest rock you can find.
and whatever you do, don't make eye contact with the tax collector. They can smell fear and spare change, because sometimes the best financial advice is also the most illegal. The response to these oppressive taxes was often immediate and visceral. When the king's commissioners arrived to collect the hated poll tax, they were met not with passive acceptance, but with open defiance.
Villages would refuse to pay, officials would be attacked, and the spark of rebellion would ignite.
The tax, intended to fund the king's wars, instead funded a revolution.
It was a direct challenge to the
authority of the crown, a clear statement that there were limits to what the common people would endure.
The violence that followed was not random.
It was a desperate, furious reaction to a system that had pushed them beyond their breaking point, demanding their very last penny. As the echoes of angry shouts fade, and the distant clang of the tax collectors'
strongbooks being smashed rings in your ears, you realize the profound impact of financial oppression.
It was a constant, grinding pressure that, when pushed too far, could erupt into explosive violence. The medieval protests, born from the burden of taxation and the indignity of tyranny, were a stark reminder that even the most powerful rulers could not indefinitely ignore the cries of their impoverished subjects.
And you, my friend, have just
understood the oppressive financial burdens that often pushed people to their breaking point, transforming economic hardship into a desperate fight for survival and dignity.
You've felt the crushing weight of medieval taxation, a relentless squeeze that pushed people to their breaking point.
But when the established legal system offered no recourse, when the courts were biased towards the powerful, and when justice
seemed a distant, unattainable ideal, the common folk sometimes took matters into their own hands. Now, you're about to see how protesters often took the law into their own hands, dispensing their own brand of justice, raw and unvarnished, in the streets and fields of medieval Europe. Imagine a scene where a hated official, perhaps a corrupt
tax collector or a tyrannical bailiff, is suddenly surrounded by an angry mob.
There's no judge, no jury, no formal trial.
The accusations are shouted, the grievances aired, and the verdict delivered by the collective roar of the crowd.
You might witness a summary execution, a public shaming, or the destruction of property associated with the perceived injustice. This wasn't about legal precedent. It was about immediate, visceral retribution, a desperate attempt to balance the scales when all other avenues had failed.
It's like a medieval version of a citizen's arrest, but with significantly more pitchforks and a much higher chance of someone losing an ear.
And probably a lot less Miranda rights, which, let's be honest, would have been lost in translation.
Anyway, mainstream historical fact, in many medieval revolts, particularly during the initial stages or in areas where central authority was weak, rebels often bypassed formal legal processes and enacted their own forms of justice. This frequently involved targeting individuals perceived as corrupt or oppressive, such as tax collectors, lawyers, or unpopular nobles, subjecting them to summary trials, public humiliation, or even execution. Property associated with these individuals or with the oppressive system, like manorial records, was also frequently destroyed, symbolizing a rejection of the established legal order. One quirky tidbit about this street justice is the symbolic nature of some of the punishments. Instead of simply killing a hated official, rebels might force them to eat the very documents that symbolize their oppression, like tax rolls or feudal charters. Or they might be paraded through the streets wearing a crown of thorns, mocking their perceived tyranny. These acts were not just about inflicting pain.
They were about public humiliation, about stripping the powerful of their dignity and authority in the eyes of the common people.
It's like a medieval performance art
piece, but with significantly more audience participation and a much more permanent impact on the performers, and probably a lot less applause, unless you count the cheers of the mob. Historians still argue whether these acts of street justice were purely anarchic and driven by uncontrolled mob violence, or if they contained elements of a popular, albeit
informal, legal tradition. reflecting a deeply ingrained sense of fairness and communal justice among the common people.
Some scholars emphasize the chaotic and brutal nature of these events, viewing them as a breakdown of order. Others contend that even in their violence, these acts often followed certain patterns, targeting specific individuals or symbols of oppression, and were rooted in a popular understanding of right and wrong, even if that understanding differed
from the official legal code. It's a bit like debating whether a playground fight is just random punching or if there's an unspoken code of conduct. The truth is likely a complex blend, with raw emotion often guided by a collective sense of what was deserved. You find yourself caught in the surge of the crowd, witnessing an impromptu trial unfold. A man, pale with terror, is dragged before the makeshift tribunal. Accusations fly, tales of his greed, his cruelty, his abuse of power. There's no defense, no appeal, only the overwhelming weight of collective grievance.
The air is thick with the scent of fear and the raw energy of a community finally enacting its revenge.
You see the faces of the accusers, etched with years of suffering, now alight with a grim satisfaction. This isn't the detached, impersonal justice of a royal court.
This is personal, immediate, and deeply felt.
It's a terrifying, yet strangely
compelling display of popular sovereignty, where the people, for a brief, bloody moment, are the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong. Another light joke. You know, I bet medieval lawyers had a very specific kind of career advice for their children.
Son, if you ever find yourself in a village square surrounded by an angry mob, just remember, your legal arguments are probably not going to be as persuasive as a well-aimed rotten tomato. So, maybe just run, because sometimes the best
legal strategy is a good pair of running shoes. The targets of this street justice were often those who directly embodied the oppressive system.
Tax collectors who literally took the bread from their mouths.
Lawyers who manipulated the complex legal system to dispossess them. Corrupt clergy who preached poverty while living in luxury.
And of course, the local lords and their agents
who wielded arbitrary power. The violence was often directed at the symbols of their authority, burning manorial rolls that recorded feudal obligations, smashing the lord's mill, or destroying the tax collector's house. It was a symbolic cleansing, an attempt to erase the physical manifestations of their subjugation. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a legal brief for the rebels was just a very long list of grievances, written in blood.
And delivered by a very angry mob.
And probably a lot less footnotes because, you know, who has time for footnotes when you're overthrowing the system? The consequences of this street justice were often immediate and severe for the victims, but also for the perpetrators. One's royal authority was re-established. Yet, for the rebels, these acts were a powerful affirmation of their agency, a moment when they reclaimed control over their lives and communities.
It was a temporary inversion of the social order, a fleeting glimpse of a world where the powerful were held accountable by the powerless. These acts, though often condemned as barbaric by the authorities, were seen by the rebels as legitimate expressions of popular will, a necessary step in righting the wrongs that had been inflicted upon them for generations. As the shouts subside,
and the fires begin to die down, leaving behind the stench of smoke and the grim reality of what has transpired, you realize the immense courage and desperation that drove these acts of street justice.
They were not just random acts of violence, but desperate cries for fairness, born from a profound sense of injustice and a legal system that offered no relief.
The memory of their fury, their willingness to take the law into their own hands, would echo through the centuries, a stark reminder that when formal justice fails, the people will find their own way to balance the scales. And you, my friend, have just witnessed how protesters often took the law into their own hands, dispensing their own brand of justice, raw and unvarnished, in the streets of medieval Europe. You've seen the raw, unvarnished justice meted out in the streets, a desperate response to a system that offered no other recourse.
But in the medieval world, there was another immense power, one that permeated every aspect of life, from the
cradle to the grave, the church.
Its role in these violent protests was often complex, sometimes contradictory, and always profoundly influential.
Now, you're about to examine the church's double edge, sometimes inciting, sometimes quelling rebellion, proving that even divine authority could be wielded for very earthly ends. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit cathedral, the scent of incense heavy in the air. A priest, perhaps one known for his fiery sermons, stands before the congregation.
His words are not of peace and submission, but of righteous anger, condemning the corruption of the powerful, the greed of the rich, and the injustice inflicted upon the poor. He might quote scripture, twisting it to justify rebellion, or invoke apocalyptic prophecies, declaring that the time for divine judgment, enacted by human hands, is at hand. You see the faces of the parishioners, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and fervent conviction, as they are told that their suffering is not God's will, but the result of human sin, and that to rise up is not a crime, but a sacred duty.
This isn't just a sermon, it's a call to arms, a spiritual sanction for violence.
It's like a medieval motivational speaker, but instead of inspiring you to climb the corporate ladder, he's inspiring you to climb the castle walls.
And probably with a lot less PowerPoint presentations. Mainstream historical fact, the church's
role in medieval protests was multifaceted.
While the institutional church generally supported the established social order and preached obedience to authority, individual clergy members, particularly those from lower ranks or those with radical
theological views, often played significant roles in inciting and leading popular revolts.
Figures like John Ball in the English Peasants' Revolt used religious rhetoric to articulate grievances and provide a moral justification for rebellion, challenging the existing hierarchy as unchristian. One quirky tidbit about these radical
clergy is how they often drew on popular religious beliefs and superstitions to bolster their message. They might interpret natural disasters, like famines or plagues, as divine signs of displeasure with the ruling elite, or weave folk prophecies into their sermons to convince people that their rebellion was part of a larger, divinely ordained
plan.
It's like a medieval conspiracy theory, but instead of being shared on Reddit, it's preached from the pulpit, and instead of leading to online arguments, it leads to actual insurrections.
And probably a lot less fact-checking, which, as we've learned, is a recurring theme. Historians still argue whether the church's involvement in inciting rebellion was a genuine reflection of its spiritual mission to advocate for the poor
and oppressed, or if it was sometimes a strategic move by dissenting factions within the clergy to gain influence or challenge rival ecclesiastical powers.
Some scholars emphasize the sincere compassion and theological conviction of those clergy who sided with the rebels, seeing their actions as a testament to the church's potential for social justice.
Others contend that such involvement could also be opportunistic, leveraging popular discontent for internal church politics or personal ambition.
It's a bit like debating whether a charity event is purely altruistic or also a good PR move.
The truth is likely a complex interplay, with genuine faith often intertwined with worldly considerations. Now, shift your perspective.
You're in a grand cathedral, but this time, the sermon is very different. The bishop, robed in finery, preaches obedience, submission to God-given authority, and the sinfulness of rebellion.
He might excommunicate rebels, threatening them with eternal damnation, or call upon the faithful to aid the king in suppressing the uprising.
The church, as a powerful institution, owned vast lands, wielded immense political influence, and had
a vested interest in maintaining stability.
It often sided with the nobility, providing moral and logistical support to crush dissent.
You see soldiers kneeling before battle, receiving blessings from priests, their swords sanctified for the brutal work of suppression. It's a stark reminder that the same divine authority that could inspire rebellion could also be used to brutally quash it. It's like a medieval double-edged sword, but instead of steel, it's made of dogma, and it cuts both ways. Another
light joke. You know, I bet medieval priests had a very specific kind of sermon they kept in their back pocket. The fire and brimstone for rebels sermon, just in case.
Because nothing says, don't mess with the king quite like the threat of eternal damnation.
And probably a lot less nuanced theological debate. The church's methods of suppression
were varied
beyond excommunication, which could effectively ostracize individuals from society. It often provided financial support to rulers, or even raised its own armed retinues to fight against rebels.
The concept of a just war was often invoked to legitimize the violence used against those who challenged the established order.
In cases of religious heresy intertwined with social rebellion, the church could unleash the full force of the Inquisition, leading to widespread persecution and massacres, as seen with the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars. The church
was not just a spiritual guide,
It was a formidable political and military power, capable of immense coercion. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a church PR campaign after a failed rebellion was something like, "Remember, God loves order."
And also the king.
And definitely not those peasants who burned down the monastery.
They're going straight to.
Well, because sometimes the divine message needs a little bit of earthly spin. The internal conflicts within the church itself also played a role. While some clergy incited rebellion, others actively sought to mediate disputes, advocating for peaceful resolutions or acting as intermediaries between rebels and authorities. Some monastic orders, particularly those focused on poverty and social justice, might sympathize with the plight of the common people, while the higher echelons of the church, deeply entrenched in the feudal system, would condemn any challenge to authority. This internal tension meant that the church's response to protests was rarely monolithic, reflecting the diverse interests and beliefs within its vast hierarchy. As the echoes of both fiery sermons and solemn condemnations fade, you realize the profound, often contradictory, role of the church in medieval protests. It was a force that could both inspire and suppress, a source of both liberation and oppression. Its double edge, wielded by different hands for different purposes, shaped the course of countless rebellions, leaving a legacy that continues to be debated by historians. And you, my friend, have just examined the complex, often paradoxical, role of the church, sometimes inciting, sometimes quelling, rebellion in the violent tapestry of medieval dissent. You've examined the church's complex role, its double edge capable of both inciting and quelling rebellion. Now, as our journey through the violent landscape of medieval protests draws to a close, let's step back and consider the enduring impact of these tumultuous events.
For while many revolts were brutally suppressed and their leaders executed, the echoes of their fury, their desperate struggle for justice, resonated through the centuries, subtly shaping the course of history.
You're about to trace how these violent medieval protests, despite their often tragic outcomes, laid the groundwork for future social change, proving that even in defeat, the seeds of resistance can blossom. Imagine looking at a medieval map, not of kingdoms and castles, but of rebellions. Each dot represents an explosion of popular anger, a moment when the common folk dared to challenge the established order. While individual revolts might have been crushed, the sheer frequency and widespread nature of these uprisings sent a clear, undeniable message to the ruling elites. There were limits to oppression.
The memory of these revolts, passed down through oral traditions, folk songs, and cautionary tales, served as a constant reminder to both the powerful and the powerless.
For the rulers, it was a warning against pushing their subjects too far. For the ruled, it was a testament to their collective strength, a spark of hope in the darkest of times.
It's like a medieval version of a very long, very bloody game of whack-a-mole, where every time you hit one, two more pop up somewhere else.
And eventually, you realize you can't win by just whacking.
Mainstream historical fact, despite the frequent suppression and often brutal outcomes of individual medieval revolts, their cumulative effect contributed significantly to long-term social and economic changes, particularly the gradual decline of serfdom in Western Europe and the increased recognition of certain rights for urban commoners.
The constant threat of popular unrest compelled authorities to consider reforms,
ease oppressive burdens, and, over time, led to a more nuanced relationship between rulers and the ruled, laying some groundwork for later concepts of popular sovereignty
and civil rights.
One quirky tidbit about this legacy is how some of the demands made by medieval rebels, which seemed utterly radical at the time, eventually became mainstream political thought centuries later.
The idea that all men are equal in the eyes of God, or that taxation should be fair and consensual, were revolutionary concepts when preached by figures like John Ball. Yet, these very ideas would later form the bedrock of Enlightenment philosophy and modern democratic movements. It's like a medieval prophet whispering into the wind, and then, 500 years later, someone finally invents a microphone and shouts it to the world, and probably gets a lot more credit for it. Historians still argue whether the changes that occurred in the wake of these protests were a direct result of the revolts themselves, forcing concessions from the ruling class, or if they were primarily driven by broader, underlying economic and social forces that would have led to similar outcomes regardless of the uprisings. Some scholars emphasize the agency of the rebels, arguing that their actions directly pressured the elite into making reforms out of fear of further unrest. Others contend that demographic shifts like the Black Death's impact on labor, economic developments like the growth of a market economy, and evolving legal frameworks were the primary drivers of change, with the revolts merely accelerating processes already in motion. It's a bit like debating whether a river carves a canyon or just follows the path of least resistance.
The truth is likely a complex interplay, with human agency and broader forces constantly shaping each other. You feel the subtle shift in the air, a gradual loosening of the old chains.
The Lord might still demand his dues, but perhaps he's a little less arbitrary, a little more cautious. The city officials might still be corrupt, but perhaps they're a little more discreet, a little more aware of the simmering anger beneath the surface. The memory of the burning manor, the sacked city hall, the heads on pikes, serves as a grim lesson for all.
You see the slow, almost imperceptible growth of new ideas, new ways of thinking about power, justice, and the rights of
the common person.
It's not a sudden revolution, but a long, arduous evolution, punctuated by moments of terrifying violence.
And you, my friend, are witnessing the slow, inexorable turning of the great wheel of history. Another light joke, you know. I bet medieval kings, after a particularly nasty revolt, probably started having very specific nightmares, not about dragons, but about 1,000 angry peasants with pitchforks demanding a written constitution, and probably a lot less sleep.
Because nothing ruins a good night's rest like the thought of your subjects wanting
rights. The legacy of resistance also manifested in the development of more sophisticated forms of governance and social control. Rulers learned that brute force alone was often insufficient to maintain long-term stability.
They began to develop more centralized bureaucracies, more effective legal systems, and even rudimentary forms of public relations, attempting to address grievances before they escalated into full-blown rebellion. The very act of suppressing
these revolts forced the state to become stronger, more organized, and more capable of managing its population, ironically contributing to the rise of the modern state.
It was a brutal feedback loop, where protest begat repression, which begat a stronger state, which in turn often begat new forms of protest. One more light joke. I imagine the medieval equivalent of a government think tank after a revolt was
just a bunch of very nervous nobles sitting around, trying to figure out how to make peasants happy without actually giving them anything, and probably concluding that more taxes were the answer, because clearly that always works. The impact
of these protests extended beyond just economic and political changes. They fostered a sense of collective identity and solidarity among the common people, a realization that they were not just isolated individuals, but a powerful force when united. This nascent class consciousness, though not fully developed in
the modern sense, laid the groundwork for future social movements and the eventual rise of organized labor. The memory of their shared struggle, their shared suffering, and their shared defiance became a powerful bond, a silent promise that the fight for justice would continue, even across generations. As the echoes of medieval shouts fade into the quiet of the night, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer becomes a gentle whisper, allow your mind to drift. The journey through the violent landscape of medieval protests, with its desperate cries for justice and its brutal acts of retribution, has come to its peaceful conclusion. You've seen how deeply ingrained the struggle for power was in the very fabric of their lives, a constant tension between the powerful and the powerless.
Feel the weight of these stories settle around you, like a soft, comforting blanket.
The world of medieval descent, once so vibrant and raw, now gently recedes, leaving behind only the faint scent of wood smoke and the quiet hum of history.
There's no need to rush, no need to worry about the next uprising or the king's retribution.
Just let the images soften, the sounds quiet, and the thoughts slow.
You are safe, you are warm, and the echoes of history are now a lullaby, guiding
you gently towards a peaceful slumber. Rest now, knowing that even in the deepest past, the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, will always find a way to resist, to demand justice, and to lay the groundwork for a better future. Let the resilient
spirits of the past watch over you as you drift into the quiet depths of sleep. Sweet dreams, my friend, sweet dreams.